Scientists really did find a mitochondrial Eve and a Y-chromosomal Adam. But here's what the headlines got completely wrong. They weren't a couple. In fact, they almost certainly lived tens of thousands of years apart, in entirely different eras. Neither of them was the first human being, or the only human alive. They are simply the statistical convergence points where our lineage tree. Most other ancient family lines simply went extinct along one specific line, leaving only their nuclear DNA. Want to see why the dates keep shifting and how the real science is far more fascinating? Check out the full documentary on our channel. See you in the dark. The discovery began with a genuinely clever piece of molecular biology. In 1987, Rebecca Ken, Mark Stoneking, and Alan Wilson, working at the University of California, Berkeley, published a paper in the journal Nature. Comparing mitochondrial DNA, a small, separate strand of genetic material located outside the cell nucleus, passed down almost exclusively from mother to child. From 147 people across 5 geographically distinct populations around the world. Mitochondrial DNA mutates fast enough, and predictably enough, to function as a kind of molecular clock, calibrated against known migration dates like the peopling of New Guinea and Australia. By measuring the accumulated genetic differences between samples, the team could estimate how long ago any two people last shared a common maternal ancestor. Tracing every lineage in their sample backward, generation by generation, all the branches eventually converged on a single woman, living somewhere in Africa, at one specific point in time. The paper also strongly supported what researchers now call the recent African origin model, the idea that all modern humans share deep, recent African ancestry, rather than having evolved independently and in parallel across separate continents. The name Mitochondrial Eve wasn't actually coined by Ken, Stoneking, or Wilson themselves. It appeared in a separate commentary article in that same issue of Nature, intended as a piece of journalistic shorthand. It stuck immediately, and it has permanently shaped how the public misunderstands the finding, even now, decades later. A companion figure followed a few years afterward, identified through an entirely different piece of the genome, the Y chromosome, passed down almost exclusively from father to son. Using the same underlying logic, researchers, including geneticist Michael Hammer, traced every man's Y chromosome lineage backward until all branches converged on one individual, inevitably nicknamed Y-chromosomal Adam. Here's where the story gets genuinely interesting, and where popular science coverage tends to quietly go wrong. The two figures were not, as far as decades of subsequent research indicate, a couple, and were almost certainly not even contemporaries in any meaningful sense. Early estimates placed mitochondrial Eve at roughly 150 to 200,000 years ago, and initial estimates for Y-chromosomal Adam placed him considerably later, sometimes tens of thousands of years apart. Later research complicated that picture substantially. Newer analyses using more complete Y chromosome sequencing pushed some estimates for Adam much further back in time, in certain studies as old as 300,000 years or more, while other researchers using different methods in different sample sets have argued for a younger date closer to Eve's own established range, occasionally even overlapping it. The dates have shifted more than once as the underlying genetic sequencing techniques steadily improved. That instability alone should tell you something important. These are statistical estimates drawn from evolving mathematical models, not fixed archaeological discoveries carved in stone. Here is the actual, central misunderstanding, and it's worth sitting with directly. Neither mitochondrial Eve nor Y-chromosomal Adam was the first human being, the only human alive during their era, or anything genuinely resembling Genesis's Adam and Eve. Both were living, ordinary members of populations that, by every line of archaeological and genetic evidence available, already numbered in the many thousands. What makes them special isn't biological uniqueness of any kind. It's purely a matter of surviving genealogy. Mitochondrial Eve is simply the most recent woman from whom every single person alive today happens to have an unbroken, uninterrupted maternal line, mother to daughter, stretching all the way to the present moment. Think of it less as a single doorway everyone passed through, and more as the last surviving footpath out of an entire forest of paths that once existed side by side. Countless other women alive at exactly the same time also have living descendants today, often millions of them, just not through an unbroken all-female chain. A woman with only sons, for instance, still passes on plenty of her own nuclear DNA to her grandchildren through those sons, but her specific mitochondrial lineage quietly ends with them, since in standard human inheritance fathers do not pass mitochondrial DNA to their own children. This actually explains something that trips people up constantly: why the calculated positions of mitochondrial Eve and Y-chromosomal Adam can shift across studies as new genetic data comes out, and may continue shifting for as long as anyone continues studying them. In every single generation, some maternal lines and some paternal lines quietly go extinct, not through anyone dying without descendants at all, but simply through the ordinary, random accumulation of daughterless mothers or sonless fathers appearing somewhere along an otherwise unbroken chain. Over enough generations, this steadily narrows the surviving pool of ancient, traceable lineages down to fewer and fewer branches. Population geneticists call this general mathematical effect coalescence, all lineages inevitably converging toward a single common ancestor if you trace them back far enough, given enough time and a sufficiently large starting population. It isn't really a discovery about one biologically exceptional man or woman standing apart from everyone else. It's closer to an unavoidable mathematical property of how family trees behave at the scale of an entire species, tens of thousands of generations deep. None of this means human ancestry can somehow be reduced to just these two named individuals, either. Nuclear DNA, which makes up the vast majority of your actual genetic material, comes from thousands upon thousands of different ancestral lines all at once, each one contributing its own separate, tangled thread to who you are today. Mitochondrial Eve and Y-chromosomal Adam represent only two extremely narrow genetic threads out of that entire tapestry, pure, unbroken, single-parent lines that happen to be unusually easy for geneticists to trace precisely because they don't get shuffled and recombined the way most of your DNA does with every single generation. Every other ancestor from that same era who has living descendants today contributed through some mix of sons and daughters, a pattern that scrambles and hides their specific genetic signature within the wider, shared human gene pool, rather than erasing their contribution to who we are entirely. Geneticists sometimes describe this directly, specifically to counter the persistent popular confusion. Identifying these two ancestors is not remotely the same claim as saying humanity descended from one single founding couple in some Eden-like garden. It is far closer to identifying the last surviving branch of two specific, extremely narrow family trees, out of many thousands of comparable trees that existed at that exact same moment in deep human history, most of which have simply, quietly gone extinct along one particular line since then. The finding also wasn't universally accepted without real, substantive scientific pushback, which is itself worth noting honestly. In 1997, evolutionary biologist Alan Templeton published a prominent critique arguing the original data didn't fully support the strongest version of the recent African origin story then being popularized, or a complete genetic replacement of other human populations coming out of Africa. That debate pushed the field toward more rigorous methods and considerably larger datasets, and the core finding, a shared, recent African maternal ancestor, has held up remarkably well since. Even as the fine details, exact dates, and precise migration timelines have continued to be refined and occasionally revised. So why does the real, accurate version of this story matter, if the popularized misreading is so much simpler, and frankly so much more dramatic? Because the actual science reveals something arguably more remarkable than any single founding couple: a documented, traceable, unbroken genetic thread connecting every living human being on Earth today back through an unbroken chain of mothers, and a separate unbroken chain of fathers, to specific individuals who lived in Africa tens of thousands of generations ago, among thousands of their own contemporaries, none of whom could have possibly known how the story would eventually turn out for their descendants. Mitochondrial Eve and Y-chromosomal Adam were never the first humans, and in all likelihood, they never even met. What they actually represent is something stranger, and quietly more moving: proof, written directly into the DNA of every person alive today, that we are all, without a single exception, distant genetic cousins, connected by an unbroken thread reaching back further than any written record, any monument, or any story humans have ever told about where we came from. The actual science took decades of careful, occasionally contentious work by real scientists to get right. Subscribe if you want to keep following the questions that don't have clean answers. See you in the dark.